The view from the penthouse was something you saw in movies. The entire city lay sprawled out below, a glittering carpet of lights that stretched all the way to the dark horizon. During the day, the sun would stream through the massive, spotless windows, illuminating the polished marble floors and the expensive, minimalist furniture. Everything was perfect, everything was in its place. It was a home that spoke of immense success, of a life built without limits. But for the woman who lived there, it had begun to feel less like a home and more like a very beautiful, very quiet prison. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and if you saw her at one of the many charity galas she attended, you would think she had it all. She wore the right clothes, smiled the right smile, and spoke with a quiet grace that people admired. But that smile never quite reached her eyes. If you looked closely, you could see a deep, tired sadness there, a worry that never went away. This worry had a name, two names, actually, her 4-year-old twins, a boy and a girl. From the moment they were born, it was clear something was wrong. The doctors used big, complicated words to explain it, but it all boiled down to a few simple, heartbreaking facts. The children's bodies did not work the way they were supposed to. They couldn't walk. They couldn't crawl. They couldn't even sit up on their own. They spent their days in specially designed chairs that supported their small, limp frames. And they couldn't speak. Not a single word. Their world was one of profound silence. They communicated through their eyes to pairs of large, deep, and incredibly observant eyes. The boy, Liam, had a thoughtful, serious gaze. He would watch the dust motes dance in a sunbeam for what felt like hours, his eyes following their slow, floating path. His sister, Sophia, had brighter, more curious eyes. They would dart towards the sound of a bird outside the window, or fix on the slow movement of the ceiling fan. Eleanor loved them with a force that was almost physical, a raw, protective ache that lived in her chest every minute of every day. She would spend hours talking to them, reading them stories, describing the world outside their window. "Look, Liam, the leaves are changing color," she would say, or "Sophia, can you hear the rain? It's tapping a song for us on the glass." But she never got an answer. No babbling, no giggles, no reaching out with tiny hands. Her words would just hang in the silent, sterile air of the penthouse, swallowed up by the emptiness. She felt like she was standing on one side of a thick glass wall, and her children were on the other. She could see them, she could love them, but she couldn't reach them. Couldn't truly know what was happening inside their minds. Her husband, a man who had built his fortune by solving impossible problems, had tried to fix this too. He hired the best doctors from all over the world, specialists with impressive degrees in kind, but ultimately helpless. Expressions would come and go. They conducted tests, scanned their brains, and prescribed therapies. The house was often filled with physical therapists and nurses, all working to stimulate the children's muscles, to try and spark some connection. Eleanor watched it all with a growing sense of despair. It felt so clinical, so mechanical. They were treating her children's bodies, but what about their minds? What about their spirits? She started to feel like a manager of a small, sad hospital ward, overseeing a never-ending cycle of appointments and exercises that showed little result. The loneliness was the hardest part. In her previous life, she had been a vibrant, social person. Now, her world had shrunk to these four walls. Her old friends didn't know how to act around her. Their conversations were filled with awkward pauses and platitudes like, "I can't even imagine what you're going through," before they quickly changed the subject to safer topics like vacations or work. She stopped reaching out. It was easier to be alone than to feel alone in a crowd. Her only outings were the charity events, where she had to play the part of the poised and gracious wife of a billionaire. She would put on her elegant dresses and her expensive jewelry, and she would smile that empty smile. People would compliment her strength, but they didn't understand. It wasn't strength. It was a performance. Inside, she was crumbling. At night, when the city was asleep and the penthouse was dark and quiet, she would often slip out of bed and go to the children's room. She would sit on the floor between their small beds, listening to their soft, even breathing. In the moonlight, they looked so peaceful, so perfect. She would study their faces, searching for a sign, any sign, of the thoughts and dreams she was sure were locked inside. "Who are you in there?" she would whisper into the silence, her voice choked with tears. "What are you thinking? Do you know how much I love you? Do you understand?" The only answer was the quiet hum of the nightlights and the distant, muffled sounds of the city. She would reach out and gently stroke Liam's hair, then Sophia's cheek. Their skin was soft and warm. They were real. They were here, but they felt a million miles away. This was her life, a gilded cage of luxury and loss. She had all the money in the world, but she would have given every last penny just to hear her son laugh, or to see her daughter take a single, wobbly step into her arms. She was the keeper of a deep and painful secret, living in a palace of silence, wondering if the wall between her and her children would ever come down. Asterisk the problem with a cage, even a gilded one, is that you start to notice every small detail of your surroundings. For Eleanor, the nights were the longest. While her husband slept, exhausted from the demands of his empire, she would often be awake, her mind spinning with a mixture of love, fear, and a deep, grinding worry that never seemed to ease. It was during these late, quiet hours that she first began to truly notice the man who cleaned the building. He was the overnight janitor. She didn't know his name. He was just a quiet presence, a part of the building's nightly rhythm, like the hum of the elevator or the distant whoosh of a car on the street below. He was an older man, with a calm face that looked like it had seen a lot of life, and he moved through the hallways with a slow, steady purpose. Eleanor's first real interactions with him were nothing more than brief, polite moments. She might be coming out to throw away a diaper, or he might be polishing the brass fixtures near her door. Their eyes would meet, and he would give a small, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he would say in a low, gentle voice. She would offer a tired smile in return, and then quickly retreat back into her apartment, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. She saw him most nights. Her insomnia had become a regular part of her life. Sometimes she would sit in the living room with a cup of tea that had gone cold, just staring at the city lights. Other times she would pace. It was on one of these pacing nights that she saw something that made her pause. She was walking past the doorway to the children's room when she noticed a shadow in the hall. Through the slightly open door, it was him, the janitor. He had stopped his mopping and was standing perfectly still, looking into the room. He wasn't being nosy or intrusive. His posture wasn't like that. It was more observant, still. He was looking at Liam and Sophia, who were sleeping in their special beds. A flicker of something hot and protective rose in Eleanor's chest. What is he looking at? She thought, a mother's instinct immediately putting her on guard. Her children were not a spectacle. She moved to close the door fully, but something in his expression stopped her. He wasn't looking at them with pity, which she hated, or with the clinical curiosity of the doctors. He was looking at them with a strange, deep kindness, almost like a gardener looking at rare and delicate plants. She stepped back into the shadows of the living room, her heart beating a little faster. She decided not to say anything. Maybe it was a one-time thing, but it happened again the next night. And the night after that, it became a strange, silent ritual. She would hear the soft sound of his cart in the hallway, the gentle slosh of water, and the quiet hum of his floor buffer. Then, as he passed her door, he would stop. He would stand there for a full minute or two, just looking in at the sleeping children. Eleanor started to watch him from her hiding spot in the dark living room. She felt a confusing mix of emotions. There was that initial spike of annoyance, of wanting to protect her children's privacy. But underneath that, there was a tiny, desperate spark of something else: curiosity. Why did he keep stopping? What did he see that made him pause his work night after night? One night, about a week after she first noticed his habit, she was particularly on edge. The children had been fussy, and a therapy session that day had been especially discouraging. She felt raw and tired when she heard the janitor stop outside her door again. That flicker of annoyance flared into a low anger. This was an intrusion. It was her private sorrow, and this stranger was making it his nightly viewing. She decided enough was enough. She would go out there and politely, but firmly, ask him to move along. She didn't want to be rude. He was just doing his job, but she needed to set a boundary. She took a deep breath, ready to confront him. But as her hand touched the door handle, she heard something. It was a sound so foreign in her home that it made her freeze in place. It was a hum, low, deep, and melodic. It was an old tune, one she hadn't heard since she was a little girl visiting her grandmother in the countryside. It was a spiritual, a song of sorrow and hope, and the janitor was humming it softly. Right there in her hallway, the anger drained out of her as quickly as it had come. She stood frozen, listening. The sound was beautiful. It was warm. It filled the silent space of her home in a way that her own strained voice, or the television, never could. It was a living sound, a human sound. Then he began to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the deep quiet of the night, she could hear every word. He wasn't speaking to her, and he wasn't exactly speaking to the children. It was as if he was thinking out loud, putting words to the thoughts he believed were already in the room. That little man in there. The janitor murmured, his voice a soft rumble. The one with the serious eyes. He's not just looking at the wall. No, sir. He's a thinker. That one. He's figuring out how the world turns. He's wondering why the stars don't fall down and why the moon changes its shape every night. He's got a map of the universe in his head. He does. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with sudden, hot tears. That was Liam. That was exactly the feeling she got from her son, a quiet, deep thinker. An old soul in a little boy's body. The man's voice continued, shifting slightly. And his sister, the one who watches everything. She's not just listening to the noises. She's hearing a story. She's making up a tale about the little light on her machine. How it's a brave little firefly lost in a big, dark cave. She's the quiet general. She is planning the next day's adventures inside her mind. A sob caught in Eleanor's throat. She had to lean against the wall for support. It was as if this stranger, this man she had barely acknowledged, had reached right through the glass wall she felt separated from her children, and had touched their very souls. He saw them. Not their broken bodies, but their vibrant, beautiful minds. He saw the people she knew were in there, the people she tried so desperately to reach. She stood there in the dark, listening to the hum of his voice, and the thumping of her own heart, realizing that the key to her gilded cage might not be a medical breakthrough or a new therapy. It might be standing right outside her door, in the worn shoes of the night janitor, holding a mop and a wisdom she had never expected to find. Asterisk for a long time, after the janitor had finished his humming and moved on down the hall, the soft sound of his cart fading away, Eleanor remained where she was. She was leaning against the wall just inside her apartment door, her legs feeling weak and shaky. The tears that had filled her eyes now rolled slowly down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of a stunned, overwhelming shock. It felt like someone had walked into her life and spoken a secret language she had been trying to learn for years. All the doctors, with their charts and their medical terms, had never once spoken about her children like that. They talked about neurons and muscle tone, about stimuli and response. They saw a problem to be solved. This man, this stranger with the gentle voice, saw to little people. He saw a thinker and a storyteller. He saw the very essences she felt in her heart, but could never find the words to describe. Her mind was racing, replaying his words over and over. A map of the universe in his head. The quiet general. How? How could he know? Was it just a lucky guess? A kind man saying kind things? But it felt too specific, too true. It felt like he had looked right past their still bodies and into their busy, beautiful minds. She spent the rest of the night in a daze. She couldn't sleep. She went into the children's room and sat between them, watching their faces in the dim light. She looked at her son, his face calm in sleep. Are you really thinking about the stars? She wondered. She looked at her daughter. Are you telling yourself a story right now? For the first time in a very long time, the silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility. The next day, she moved through her routines like a ghost. The physical therapist came and went, and Eleanor watched the exercises with a new, critical eye. It all seemed so focused on the body, on making limbs move. What about the spirit inside? What about the thinker and the storyteller? She felt a strange new feeling growing inside her, a flicker of hope. Mixed with a deep and burning curiosity, she found herself waiting for the night. The day seemed to drag on forever. When her husband came home from work, she almost told him about the janitor. But she stopped herself. How would she even explain it? A man who cleans the halls hummed to the children, and I started to cry. He would likely smile kindly, pat her hand, and tell her she was too tired, that her emotions were getting the better of her. He lived in a world of facts and figures, and this didn't fit. So, she kept the strange, precious secret to herself. Finally, night fell. The city lights twinkled outside, and the big apartment grew quiet. She put the children to bed, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked them in. She didn't turn on the bright living room lights. Instead, she sat in her now usual spot in the dark, waiting. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of Liam and Sophia. And then, she heard it. The familiar, soft rumble of the cleaning cart's wheels in the hallway. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She heard the gentle slosh of water, the soft thud of the mop bucket being set down. She held her breath. He did his work, the mop swishing back and forth on the marble floor. Then, as before, he stopped. She saw his shadow fall across the crack of light under the door. He was there. He was standing in his usual spot, looking in. A long moment of silence passed. Eleanor wondered if he would hum again. She found herself hoping, desperately, that he would. And then, he did. It was a different tune this time, just as old and melodic. It was a little sad, but also strong, like a tree that has weathered many storms. He hummed it softly, the notes floating through the door and filling the quiet space. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. When the humming faded, he spoke again. His voice that same low, gentle rumble. The little man is dreaming of big spaces tonight, he murmured, almost to himself. He's not in his bed. In his mind, he's floating. He's as light as a feather, looking down at the world from a great height. He likes the quiet up there. It helps him think. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, and she looked at Liam. His breathing was deep and even, his face peaceful. Was it true? Was he dreaming of floating? It made a strange kind of sense. He always seemed so frustrated by his body, by its inability to move. Of course, his mind would want to be free. The janitor's attention shifted. And the little general. She's listening to my song. She's not sure what the words are, so she's making up her own. In her story, the song is about a river that talks. It's telling secrets to the stones on the bank. Another wave of shock and recognition washed over Eleanor. Sophia's eyes were moving slightly under her eyelids, a sign she often had when she was in a deep sleep. She was listening. She was always listening. This was not a coincidence. This was not a lucky guess. This was happening. This man, whose name she didn't even know, could somehow see her children, the protective wall she had built around herself and her family, the one made of money, privacy, and grief, suddenly felt flimsy and unnecessary. This wasn't an intrusion. This was a connection. An unseen thread was being woven between this kind man and her children, a thread of understanding that bypassed all the broken pathways in their bodies. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she couldn't just hide in the dark and listen anymore. She had to talk to him. She had to know how he was doing this. She had to thank him for giving her a glimpse of her children's inner worlds, a gift more valuable than anything she had ever owned. As his cart began to move away, she made a decision. Tomorrow night, she would not be hiding in the shadows. Tomorrow night, she would be waiting for him by the door. The apartment was quiet after the janitor moved on, but inside Eleanor, a storm was raging. She stood frozen by the door, her ears still pressed slightly against the cool wood, as if she could still catch an echo of his voice. The words he had spoken echoed in her mind, not like a sound, but like a key turning in a lock she didn't even know existed. A thinker. A storyteller. How could a stranger, a man who saw them for a few minutes each night, understand her children so perfectly? The doctors and therapists used words from textbooks. They saw a list of symptoms. This man saw personalities. He saw souls. She finally pushed herself away from the door and walked on unsteady legs back to the children's room. She stood in the doorway, watching them sleep. Her son with his serious, peaceful face. Her daughter, with her lips parted just so. She saw them differently now. The silence in the room was no longer a wall. It was a curtain, and the janitor had just pulled it back a little, giving her a peek at what was behind it. For the rest of the night, she couldn't sleep. She was too full of a strange, buzzing energy. It wasn't quite happiness, and it wasn't relief. It was the feeling of being lost in a dark forest for years and suddenly seeing a single, distant light. You don't know if it leads to safety, but the mere fact that it exists changes everything. The next day, the routine felt different. When the physical therapist arrived, a cheerful woman with a bag full of tools, Eleanor watched with new eyes. The therapist was trying to get Liam to grasp a small red ring. She was gently moving his fingers, talking to him in a bright, encouraging voice. "Come on, sweetie. You can do it. Just squeeze for me." Eleanor watched her son's eyes. They weren't looking at the ring. They were looking past it, at the sunlight making a pattern on the far wall. He wasn't interested in the ring. He was interested in the light. He was, as the janitor had said, a thinker. He was wondering about the light. The therapist saw a hand that wouldn't close. The janitor saw a mind that was always open. It was a small shift in perspective. But for Eleanor, it felt enormous. She found herself growing impatient for the day to end. Her usual dread of the long, silent night was replaced by a nervous anticipation. She wanted to hear that soft humming again. She needed to hear what the janitor would say tonight. It was like waiting for the next chapter of the most important book she had ever read. When her husband came home, he was talking about a big business deal. He used words like acquisition and market share. Eleanor nodded, but the words seemed to float past her. Her world, which had once revolved around his, had suddenly become very small and very specific. It was contained within the four walls of the children's room and the hallway just outside it. That night, she prepared almost like she was expecting a guest. She made sure the area near the door was clear. She didn't want to be hiding in the dark living room again. She wanted to be closer. She sat on a small, padded bench in her foyer, just a few feet from the front door, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like a young girl waiting for a secret meeting. The wait felt endless. Every minute was an hour. She listened to the sounds of the building settling, the faint whir of the elevator, the occasional siren from the city below. Finally, she heard the sound she had been waiting for, the soft, rolling sound of the janitor's cart. Her heart began to pound. She could hear him working his way down the hall. The swish of the mop, the quiet clang of the bucket. The sound got closer and closer. She held her breath. He stopped outside her door. There was a moment of silence. She could picture him standing there, looking through the crack, his kind eyes taking in the scene of her sleeping children. And then, the humming began, this time. The tune was different. It was a little brighter, a little more hopeful. It sounded like a sunrise. Eleanor felt her shoulders relax. She closed her eyes and just listened, letting the simple, wordless melody fill her up. When he started to speak, his voice was so soft it was almost a whisper. But she could hear every word perfectly. The little man had a busy day today, the janitor murmured. All that thinking tires a person out. His mind, it's like a library after hours. All the books are back on the shelves, and everything is quiet and in order. He's resting now, getting ready for tomorrow's work. A small, watery smile touched Eleanor's lips. It was true. The therapy session, the attempts to engage him, it did tire him out. She had always seen it as physical exhaustion. But what if it was mental too? What if his mind was so active, so busy exploring its own universe, that the outside world was just a distraction? The janitor continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming a little more playful. But his sister, she's not resting. Not her mind. Oh no, she's putting on a play in her head. The characters are the shadows from the nightlight. That one, the long thin shadow, he's the hero. And the little round one, she's the one who needs rescuing. It's a whole drama, right there on the ceiling. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes again. But this time they were warm tears of joy. She often saw Sophia's eyes tracking the shadows on the ceiling. She had thought it was just a random movement. She never imagined her daughter was directing a whole play. In that moment, any last bit of doubt or suspicion vanished. This was real. This connection was real. This man wasn't just being nice. He had a gift. He could see the invisible world where her children lived. As the sound of his cart began to fade down the hallway, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She couldn't just be a silent listener in the shadows anymore. She had to talk to him. She had to thank him. She had to learn how to see her children the way he did. She made a promise to herself. The next night, she would open the door. The next day was the longest of Eleanor's life. Every minute felt like it was made of slow, thick syrup. She went through the motions of caring for the children, but her mind was somewhere else. It was out in the hallway, waiting for the night to come. The nervousness from the night before had turned into a solid, steady decision. She was going to talk to him. She thought about what she would say. She practiced the words in her head. Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice. No, that sounded too formal. I heard you speaking to my children. That sounded like an accusation. She gave up on practicing. She would just have to speak from the heart and hope the right words came out. When evening finally came, she put the children to bed with a new kind of tenderness. She looked at their faces, really looked at them, trying to see the thinker and the storyteller. She smoothed her son's hair and whispered, "What will you think about tonight?" She adjusted her daughter's blanket and said, "What story will you tell?" They, of course, did not answer with words. But for the first time, the silence felt like a conversation. She didn't sit in the dark living room. She didn't hide on the bench in the foyer. Tonight, she stood right by the front door. She leaned against the wall, her heart thumping so loudly she was sure it could be heard in the hall. She listened for the familiar sounds. There it was. The soft rumble of the wheels. The gentle slosh of the water in the bucket. Her mouth went dry. This was it. She heard him stop just outside. There was a pause. She knew he was looking in, getting ready to hum his nightly song. Before she could lose her nerve, she took a deep breath and slowly, quietly, turned the doorknob and pulled the door open. The janitor was standing there, just as she had pictured him. He had his back to the door, looking into the children's room. When he heard the door open, he jumped slightly and turned around. For a moment, they just stared at each other. He looked surprised and a little worried, like a child who had been caught doing something he shouldn't. "I'm so sorry," he said quickly, his voice low and respectful. "I didn't mean to disturb you, ma'am. I'll move along." He began to turn his cart away. "No. Please, wait," Eleanor said, her voice coming out in a rushed whisper. She stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door almost closed behind her so as not to wake the children. "Please, don't go." He stopped and turned back to her, his expression cautious and confused. Eleanor wrung her hands slightly, trying to find the words. "I have to ask you. For the past few nights, I've been listening. I've heard you. I've heard what you say about my children. A look of deep embarrassment washed over his face. He looked down at the floor. Mom, I apologize. It was out of line. It won't happen again. You don't understand, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. She took a small step closer. What you said. About my son being a thinker. About my daughter telling herself stories. How did you know? He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be trying to decide if she was angry or something else. He saw the tears shining in her eyes, and his expression softened from worry to gentle concern. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. It's not something I know, ma'am, he said slowly. It's something I feel. You spend enough time around people who the world has decided are broken. You start to learn to look past the outside. He gestured softly with his head towards the slightly open door. Their bodies are quiet, but their spirits are loud. You just have to learn how to listen with your eyes. Eleanor felt a sob catch in her throat. But how? She whispered. I'm their mother. I've been trying to listen for years. I never saw what you saw. Not so clearly. The janitor gave a small, sad smile. Maybe you were trying too hard to hear them with your ears. Maybe you were looking for words. He paused, choosing his words carefully. My grandson. He was a lot like your little ones. Not in his body, but in his mind. The world was too loud for him. He didn't speak much. The doctors had a lot of big words for him, too. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of work. They saw a problem. I just saw my grandson. I learned that he spoke in different ways. A certain look in his eye meant he was happy. The way he tapped his finger meant he was listening to music in his head. I learned his language. He looked back at Eleanor, his gaze steady and kind. I suppose I've just gotten into the habit of looking for that language. With your two, I see it. The boy, with his deep, watching eyes, he's not staring into space. He's studying it. The girl, with her quick, noticing eyes, she's not just hearing sounds. She's collecting them, like little treasures, to use in the stories she makes up. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, feeling like all the air had been knocked out of her. It was so simple. So profoundly simple. She had been so focused on what her children couldn't do, speak, move, respond, that she had stopped seeing what they could do. They could observe. They could feel. They could think. They could imagine. This man who pushed a mop for a living had seen it instantly. He hadn't been trying to fix them. He had just been willing to meet them where they were, in their quiet world. Would you? Eleanor began, her voice shaky. Would you be willing to come by sometime during the day? To talk to them? To show me? She felt awkward asking, like she was hiring another therapist. I would pay you for your time, of course. It's just, you're the first person who has ever really seen them. The janitor looked touched and a little surprised. He nodded slowly. I finish my shift at 6 in the morning. I could come by after that for a little while. No payment needed, ma'am. It would be my honor. Thank you, Eleanor whispered. The words filled with more gratitude than she knew how to express. My name is Eleanor. He gave a small, respectful nod. Samuel, ma'am, as Samuel turned and pushed his cart down the hall. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long time. The hallway looked the same. The polished floor, the muted lighting. But everything felt different. The heavy, hopeless silence that had filled her home for years had been cracked open. For the first time, a real, genuine feeling of hope began to bloom in her chest. Fragile and beautiful, like the first flower after a long, hard winter. The next morning, Eleanor was awake long before the sun came up. A nervous energy buzzed under her skin. She moved quietly around the kitchen, making tea she wouldn't drink, straightening pillows that were already straight. What if it was different in the daylight? What if the magic she felt in the quiet of the night disappeared under the bright morning sun? What if Samuel regretted agreeing to come? At 6:15, there was a soft, almost hesitant knock on the door. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She smoothed her shirt, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Samuel stood there. He was no longer in his janitor's uniform, but in a simple, clean button-down shirt and dark trousers. He looked a little tired from his long night of work, but his eyes were just as kind and calm as they had been in the hallway. Good morning, Mom, he said softly. Please, call me Eleanor, she said, stepping aside to let him in. And thank you for coming. The children were already in their special chairs in the living room, bathed in the soft, early morning light. Samuel walked over to them slowly, not with the confidence of a doctor, but with the quiet respect of a visitor entering a sacred space. He didn't immediately start talking. He just stood there for a moment, looking at them, a small smile on his face. It was the same way he had looked at them in the hallway, and seeing it in her own home, in the full light of day, made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears. He truly saw them. Good morning, you two, he finally said, his voice a warm, gentle rumble. He pulled up a simple wooden stool and sat down near them, putting himself at their eye level. He didn't look at Eleanor for instruction. He simply focused on the children. He started to hum, the same kind of old, melodic tune he had hummed in the hall. The sound was soft and filled the room. Eleanor held her breath, watching her children. Her son, Liam, slowly turned his head. It was a small movement, one that would be easy to miss, but Eleanor saw it. He was turning towards the sound, his deep, thoughtful eyes fixed on Samuel's face. Samuel noticed it too. He stopped humming and smiled at the boy. "You like that one, don't you?" he said quietly. "It's an old song. It's about finding your way home." Then, Samuel did something simple. He started to talk about the weather. But it wasn't a boring report. He described the sky outside, how the dark blue was slowly being pushed away by streaks of pink and orange. He talked about the way the light was hitting the buildings, turning their windows to gold. He spoke to them not as if they were patients, but as if they were fellow observers of the world. Eleanor watched, mesmerized. She saw her daughter, Sophia, let out a soft sigh. Her little fingers, which usually lay still, twitched slightly. Her eyes were wide, following the sound of Samuel's voice as he painted a picture with his words. This went on for about 20 minutes. Samuel just talked and hummed. He didn't try to get them to hold anything. He didn't try to make them move. He was just sharing the morning with them. Then something happened that made Eleanor's hand fly to her mouth to stop a gasp. Samuel was telling a story about a little cloud that was lonely. He made a soft, whooshing sound with his mouth like the wind. And Sophia, her eyes bright and focused, let out a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a soft, cooing noise, a little ooh from the back of her throat. It was a sound of pure pleasure, a sound Eleanor had never heard before. Samuel stopped his story and looked at the little girl, his face glowing with a quiet joy. "You like that, little general?" he whispered. "You like the story of the cloud?" Sophia's eyes stayed locked on him, and she made the sound again, a little stronger this time. It was a breakthrough. Not a medical one, not one that could be measured on a chart. It was a human one. It was a connection. Her daughter was joining the conversation in the only way she could. In that moment, the last of the glass wall that Eleanor had felt between her and her children shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't about fixing them. It was about joining them. It was about learning to live in their world, a world of quiet observation and deep feeling, instead of constantly trying to pull them into hers. When Samuel stood up to leave, Eleanor was crying, but she was smiling through her tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what you've given me. You gave it to yourself." "Mom," he said gently, "you just needed a little reminder of what to look for." After he left, the apartment felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was peaceful. Eleanor went and sat on the floor between her children's chairs. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw the deep thinker. She looked at her daughter and saw the imaginative storyteller. She began to talk to them, not with the frantic hope of getting a response, but with the quiet joy of sharing her thoughts. She told them about the dream she had last night. She described the funny-shaped pancake she had burned that morning. She hummed a little of Samuel's song, and she watched. She saw the subtle ways they spoke back, the way Liam's breathing slowed when he was calm, the way Sophia's eyes sparkled when she was interested. She was learning their language. Life didn't become perfect overnight. The challenges were still there. The therapies continued, but the feeling of hopelessness was gone. It was replaced by a new purpose. Eleanor learned to be still. She learned to listen with her heart. Samuel became a regular visitor, a quiet friend who helped them all navigate this new way of being a family. The Vance family was still rich in the eyes of the world, but their true wealth was no longer in their bank accounts. It was in the quiet moments of understanding, in the gentle hum of an old song, and in the profound lesson that sometimes the most powerful healing doesn't come from a medicine or a therapy, but from a simple human connection. It comes from someone who is willing to see the person inside, and in doing so, helps them find their way out.